The quiet panic. You guys have been absolutely going crazy in the comments asking me to explore some of the most terrifying places I can find. And honestly, I've been putting this one off for months because just thinking about it gives me the chills. But today, I'm finally doing it. I'm about to enter a tunnel system that runs directly underneath the city sewers, and according to local urban explorers, this place has a history that will make your skin crawl. Now, before I get into what happened down there, let me give you some context about this place because the story behind it is absolutely insane. This tunnel system was built back in the 1920s as part of an underground maintenance network for the city's sewer system. Workers would use these tunnels to access different parts of the sewage infrastructure without having to constantly dig up the streets. Sounds pretty normal, right? Well, here's where it gets disturbing. In 1943, 3 maintenance workers went down into these tunnels for a routine inspection and never came back up. The search teams found their equipment scattered throughout the tunnels, but no bodies were ever recovered. Then in 1967, a homeless man who had been living in the upper levels of the sewer system told police he could hear screaming coming from deep within the tunnel walls every night around 3 in the morning. When officers investigated, they found scratch marks carved into the concrete walls that definitely weren't there during previous inspections. But here's the part that really freaked me out when I was researching this place. Over the past 15 years, at least 7 urban explorers have reported the exact same experience down in these tunnels. They all describe hearing footsteps following them, seeing shadows moving just outside their flashlight beams, and feeling this overwhelming sense of dread that gets stronger the deeper they go. 2 of them actually had to be treated for severe panic attacks after they made it back to the surface. The most recent incident happened just 6 months ago when a guy named Marcus went down there with his camera crew to film content for his exploration channel. They made it about halfway through the main tunnel before their equipment started malfunctioning. All 3 of their cameras died simultaneously. Their flashlights began flickering, and that's when they heard what Marcus described as the sound of someone dragging something heavy across the concrete floor somewhere behind them in the darkness. Now I know what you're thinking. This has got to be some kind of urban legend that people made up to scare explorers away from a dangerous area. That's exactly what I thought too until I started digging deeper into the history of this place. I found old city records that mention multiple unexplained incidents in these tunnels dating all the way back to the 1950s. Workers refusing to go down there alone, reports of tools mysteriously moving from one location to another, and several documented cases of people hearing voices when they were supposedly the only ones in the tunnel system. What really convinced me that something genuinely strange was going on down there was when I contacted the city's current maintenance department. The supervisor I spoke with, who's been working with the sewer system for over 20 years, told me they stopped sending crews into those particular tunnels back in 2019. When I asked him why, he got really quiet for a moment and then said, "Let's just say we found other ways to handle maintenance in that area." That response gave me chills. But it also made me more determined than ever to see what's really going on down there. So I spent weeks preparing for this exploration. I got permission from the city to access the tunnel system for documentation purposes, which took forever because apparently they really don't want people going down there. I also invested in some serious equipment because if something was going to happen, I wanted to make sure I captured every second of it. I brought 3 different cameras with backup batteries, professional-grade LED lights, a motion detector, an EMF reader to pick up any electromagnetic disturbances, and a digital audio recorder that could capture sounds my ears might miss. I even got one of those thermal imaging cameras because several people mentioned seeing shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. The entrance to these tunnels is located in an industrial area on the east side of the city. It's this massive concrete structure that looks like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie. The metal door that leads down into the tunnel system is covered in rust and graffiti, and honestly, just standing next to it made me feel uneasy. There's something about the way the air seems to get colder as you approach the entrance that immediately puts you on edge. I decided to start my exploration around noon because I wanted to have plenty of daylight left when I came back up, assuming everything went according to plan. As I was setting up my equipment and doing final checks on all my cameras, I noticed something that made me pause. There were fresh footprints in the dirt around the entrance. Not old ones that had been there for weeks or months, but prints that looked like they'd been made within the past few days. That discovery should have been my first warning to turn around and go home. But I was already committed to doing this exploration. Plus, I figured the footprints probably belonged to city workers or other urban explorers who had been down there recently. Still, as I opened that heavy metal door and felt the cold air rushing up from the darkness below, every instinct I had was telling me to walk away. The entrance leads to a steep concrete staircase that descends about 30 feet underground. Each step echoed off the walls in a way that made it sound like someone else was walking right behind me. I kept turning around with my flashlight, but of course there was nobody there. Just that narrow stairwell disappearing into blackness above me. At the bottom of the stairs, the tunnel opens up into this main corridor that stretches out in both directions as far as my light could reach. The walls are made of old concrete that's stained with decades of moisture and covered in patches of some kind of dark growth that I really didn't want to examine too closely. The floor is uneven and covered with puddles of water that reflect your light back at you in really unsettling ways. But what immediately caught my attention was the smell. It wasn't just the typical sewer odor you'd expect. There was something else mixed in with it. Something that reminded me of old wet clothes, or maybe something that had been left to rot in a damp basement for years. The air down there feels thick and heavy, like it's pressing against your chest with every breath you take. I decided to head east first, because that's the direction where most of the reported incidents had occurred. According to the maps I'd studied, that section of the tunnel system extends for almost half a mile before connecting to a series of smaller maintenance passages. My plan was to document everything I could see and hopefully make it to at least the halfway point before turning back. As I started walking deeper into the tunnel, I immediately noticed how my footsteps seemed to echo for much longer than they should have in a space like this. Each step I took created this weird reverberating sound that seemed to bounce off the walls and come back to me from multiple directions. It was like the tunnel was amplifying and distorting every sound I made. About 10 minutes into my walk, I stopped to check my equipment and make sure everything was still recording properly. That's when I heard it for the first time. It was so faint that I almost missed it, but there was definitely another sound coming from somewhere deeper in the tunnel. It sounded like water dripping, but with this strange rhythmic pattern that seemed almost deliberate. I started recording with my audio equipment, trying to capture whatever that sound was, but as soon as I turned on the recorder, the dripping stopped completely. The silence that followed was somehow even more unsettling than the mysterious noise had been. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, just listening to my own breathing and the distant hum of the city above. I decided to keep moving forward, but now I was being extra careful about where I stepped and how much noise I was making. The thermal camera wasn't picking up anything unusual yet, just the cold concrete walls and the slightly warmer areas where water had collected on the floor. But about 20 minutes deeper into the tunnel, something changed. The EMF reader I was carrying suddenly started going crazy. The needle was jumping all over the place, indicating some kind of massive electromagnetic disturbance coming from somewhere up ahead. Now I know there could be perfectly logical explanations for this. Old electrical systems, underground power cables, that kind of thing. But combined with everything else I'd heard about this place, it definitely made my heart rate spike. That's when I noticed the scratch marks everyone had mentioned. They were carved deep into the concrete wall on my right side, running parallel to the floor for about 15 feet. These weren't random scratches from construction equipment or normal wear and tear. They looked deliberate, almost like claw marks, and they were positioned at exactly the height where someone walking through the tunnel would naturally drag their fingers along the wall. I spent several minutes documenting the scratches with my cameras, getting close-up shots from different angles. But while I was focused on filming, I started to get this overwhelming feeling that someone was watching me. You know that sensation when you can just sense another person's presence even when you can't see them? It was exactly like that, except amplified about 10 times. I spun around with my flashlight, scanning the tunnel behind me. But there was nothing there except empty concrete and shadows. Still, the feeling persisted, and it was getting stronger with every step I took deeper into the system. My hands were starting to shake slightly, which was making it harder to keep my camera steady. About 30 minutes into the exploration, I reached a section where the main tunnel branched off into 3 smaller passages. According to my research, this was roughly the halfway point that I'd planned to reach before turning back. But something about those 3 dark openings stretching away into nothingness made me want to push further. The middle passage looked like it hadn't been used in decades. There were cobwebs stretched across the entrance and a thick layer of dust on the floor. But here's what really caught my attention. In that dust, I could clearly see a single set of footprints leading into the passage and disappearing into the darkness. Fresh footprints. Someone had been down here recently, and they'd gone into the most abandoned-looking section of the entire tunnel system. Against every rational thought in my head, I decided to follow those footprints. I switched on all my lights and started making my way into the narrow passage. The ceiling was lower here, maybe only about 6 feet high, and the walls seemed to close in on both sides. It felt like being inside a concrete coffin. The footprints were easy to follow at first, but after about 50 yards, they just stopped. Not like the person had turned around or stepped to one side. They literally ended in the middle of the passage, as if whoever made them had just vanished into thin air. I spent 10 minutes examining the area around where the prints ended, looking for any explanation, but I couldn't find anything. That's when my motion detector started beeping. Something was moving somewhere behind me, back toward the main tunnel. I froze completely, not even breathing, just listening. The beeping stopped, but now I could hear something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing through the concrete passages. Someone else was down there with me. My first instinct was to call out, thinking maybe it was a maintenance worker or another explorer. But something stopped me. Those footsteps didn't sound right. They were too measured, too purposeful, like someone was deliberately trying to move quietly but not quite succeeding. I turned off my motion detector and started making my way back toward the main tunnel as quietly as possible. But the footsteps seemed to be getting closer, and now they were coming from multiple directions. It sounded like there were at least 2 people moving through the tunnel system, and they were positioning themselves between me and the exit. When I reached the junction where the 3 passages met, I stopped and listened carefully. The footsteps had stopped too, but I could hear breathing. Heavy, labored breathing that seemed to be coming from the passage to my left. I pointed my thermal camera in that direction, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There was a heat signature about 60 feet down that passage. The outline of a human figure just standing there motionless in the darkness. But here's what really freaked me out. The figure was facing directly toward me, like it had been waiting for me to look in that direction. I started backing away slowly, trying not to make any noise, but my foot hit a loose piece of concrete and sent it skittering across the floor. The sound echoed through all 3 passages, and immediately the heat signature started moving toward me. That was enough. I turned and started running back toward the main tunnel as fast as I could. Behind me, I could hear multiple sets of footsteps now, all moving quickly and seeming to come from different directions. My lights were bouncing wildly as I ran, creating these crazy shadows on the walls that made it impossible to tell what was real and what was just my imagination. I made it back to the main tunnel and started sprinting toward the entrance. My equipment was banging against my sides, my breathing was ragged, and every few seconds I'd glance back to see if anything was following me. I couldn't see anyone, but those footsteps were still echoing through the tunnel system, and they seemed to be keeping pace with me. The strangest part was that as I got closer to the exit, the footsteps gradually faded away until I couldn't hear them anymore. By the time I reached the staircase leading back to the surface, everything was completely silent except for my own panicked breathing and pounding heartbeat. I practically flew up those stairs and burst through the metal door into the daylight. Standing there in the fresh air, trying to catch my breath and process what had just happened, I realized that my hands were still shaking and I was covered in sweat despite the cold air in the tunnels. When I got home and reviewed all the footage and audio recordings, most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Concrete walls, my voice narrating what I was seeing, the sounds of my footsteps echoing through empty passages. But there were a few things that made me seriously question what I'd experienced down there. The EMF readings showed massive spikes at the exact moments when I felt like I was being watched. The audio recordings picked up sounds that I didn't notice while I was down there, including what sounds distinctly like whispered voices during the section where I was following those mysterious footprints. And most disturbing of all, the thermal camera footage clearly shows multiple heat signatures moving through the tunnel system, but they don't move like normal people would move. I've watched that thermal footage probably 50 times now, and I still can't explain what I captured. Those figures seem to glide rather than walk, and they appear and disappear in ways that don't make any physical sense. Look, I know how this sounds. I know that everything I experienced down there could potentially have logical explanations. Maybe there were homeless people living in parts of the tunnel system. Maybe the electromagnetic readings were caused by underground cables or equipment. Maybe my imagination got the better of me in a creepy environment. But I also know what I felt down there. And I know what my equipment recorded. Something is happening in those tunnels that goes beyond normal urban exploration encounters. Whether it's paranormal activity, dangerous individuals using the tunnels for illegal purposes, or just the psychological effects of being in such an oppressive environment, I can tell you one thing for certain. I will never go back down there again. If you're thinking about exploring these tunnels yourself, please don't. The city has them blocked off for good reasons, and after what I experienced, I completely understand why maintenance crews refuse to work in that area. Some places are meant to stay hidden in the darkness. That's it for this exploration, guys. If you made it this far, you're absolutely insane, but I appreciate you sticking with me through this terrifying experience. Let me know in the comments if you think I should investigate other haunted locations around the city, but maybe stick to places that are above ground next time. And if you want to see more content like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because I've got some seriously disturbing locations lined up for future videos.